Ben from Joe Bean here. Today we're going to be talking about specialty coffee terminology and specifically some of the terminology that we use on our coffee bag packaging. So let's take a look at our label and we'll just start at the top and work our way down. The first thing you'll notice on all of these coffees is we have the name for the coffee. And the names are a little bit different depending on where it's coming from. Some of these coffees you'll see just an individual farmer's name. Other of these coffees you'll see maybe the name of the farm or maybe the name of a lot within a farm. And then other coffees you'll see maybe a name for the lot that's been assembled by a group of farmers or maybe a lot that's been assembled by a cooperative. But with all these coffees, we're trying to give you the most specific information that we have about where this coffee is coming from. Moving down the label, the next thing you'll notice is we have these circles on all of our coffees. These circles are based on the tasting notes that we put together for each coffee, and each color correlates with the tasting notes that we have on the back. The idea is we wanted to give a suggestion of what we feel the coffee tastes like without being too explicit about what you're supposed to taste. Sometimes people have a tendency to kind of measure their abilities against what we write on the back of the bag. And if they can't identify something, they feel like maybe they're somehow inadequate at tasting, or maybe they disagree and they feel like they taste something totally different, which is absolutely valid. So we wanted to give you kind of a broad sense of flavor without being too specific, too pushy about it, if you will. So this is a little bit more of an abstraction of what we feel like the coffee presents as. So for example, with this coffee, we've got this kind of orange color at the top, which is corresponding with apricot. Next we have this nice purple shade, which is corresponding with lilac. Then we have this kind of dark brown color, which is correlating with the chocolate bar. And then last we have this nice vibrant green, which is correlating with a green apple type taste. The last thing you'll see on our front label is the country of origin that each of these coffees comes from. It's important to note that when you're tasting coffees from across a country, you will definitely see some similarities between different farms, but you can also see some pretty marked differences between different coffees, different farmers, different varietals, different processing methods. So do your best to keep an open mind when you're tasting coffees and try not to make too many strong associations with country of origin, but do take note if you feel like you notice similarities. Moving to the back of our labels here, at the very top, we'll give you kind of a brief summary of what's special about this coffee. And we only have so much room on these labels, so we recommend going to our website and checking out the page for each coffee for a little bit more in-depth information. But this will give you a brief summary about what makes each of these coffees special and unique. Underneath that, you'll see our tasting notes. Now, when we're tasting coffee, we are referencing things that it reminds us of. So none of these are any somehow added or artificial flavors. And it's also important to note that taste is a very personal thing. So this is what we feel like it tastes like, but you might have slightly different experiences, and that's absolutely okay. With all of these flavors, as much as possible, we try and reference a tasting wheel put together by the World Coffee Research Group. And they've done a really tremendous job trying to establish some more common language that all of us coffee professionals can use when we describe coffees. And that just helps make it a little bit more universal when we're describing flavor to hopefully make it slightly less subjective. But at the end of the day, whatever's happening in your own mouth and palate is what you're experiencing. So when you're tasting, keep an open mind, take notes, and when you are eating different foods in your life, try and log those things in the back of your brain so you start building this nice big bank of flavor references. Moving down, the next thing you'll see is we will try and give you the region that a coffee is coming from. It can be a little bit tricky to figure out exactly how specific to be So we typically try and pick an area that's recognizable enough where you might be able to reference other coffees that have come from that region or nearby regions. But this is telling you where in a country a coffee is being grown. Again, similar to country of origin, regions within a country, you'll see some similarities of flavor, but you can also see some very big differences in flavor. So try to make associations, but don't get too locked in on your beliefs with what a flavor should be for a specific area. Always keep an open mind and just see what your palate tells you. Moving down from there, we have altitude. Now, altitude refers to the height where a coffee's grown, and this is important. When we're growing coffee, what we want is nice sun exposure during the day so that the coffee plant is able to grow and develop nice ripe cherries. But we want that coffee plant to cool a little bit at night so that it slows down that conversion process where it converts the sugars that it produced during the day into food for the plant. We want those sugars to stay as sugars. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna help our coffee to be denser, sweeter, more complex, more interesting. As a general rule of thumb, the higher up a coffee's grown, it tends to be a little bit denser. And this matters both from it's going to taste really wonderful and delicious if we have these very dense, complex coffees, but this can also impact how you are brewing the coffee. Denser coffees tend to be a little bit more difficult to extract, so you might need to work a little bit harder to get a full extraction out of some of these really dense coffees. Moving down, another thing you'll see here is processing. Now, what processing refers to is how the fruit of the coffee cherry is removed to get to the seed on the inside, which is what we are then roasting and making coffee out of. There are three different main types of processing that you'll see. The first is what's called a washed process, which is the most common that you'll see. For a washed coffee, they are taking the skin of the coffee fruit, they are stripping it off, so you just have that sticky coffee mucilage left around the seeds. That coffee mucilage is then fermented till it starts to break itself down, and then it's washed clean in channels, and then you have the coffee surrounded in the kind of papery parchment layer that's sun-dried, and from there you remove the parchment and get down to the seed itself that's then again roasted and turned into coffee. For washed coffees, typically you see very clean flavors with maybe a little bit more of a crisp, pronounced acidity. The other nice thing about washed coffees is that because you're doing it in water, you are able to separate out coffees by density. And again, the dense coffees are the ones that are really sweet, really complex, so they can make sure they're selecting the densest coffees when they're building our micro lots here. The next type of processing method that you might see is what's called a honey process. So with the honey process, the skin of the coffee fruit is removed, so you just have that sticky mucilage. But instead of fermenting and washing clean the mucilage, that mucilage is allowed to dry all the way on the coffee bean. And what that does is you tend to get a little bit more sweetness, a little bit more kind of perfumey smells from the coffee, and that acidity starts to broaden out just a little bit, so it's not quite as kind of pinpoint crisp as you see with a lot of washed coffees. The final method that you'll see is what's called a natural process. Now with the natural process coffee, the entire coffee cherry is sun-dried all at once until it's this kind of stiff husk, and that husk is removed to get into the seed itself. The natural process coffees tend to produce these very big, wild, fruity, floral, kind of crazy aromas in coffees. And the acidity tends to be this kind of big, soft, juicy acidity instead of that really kind of crisp acidity that you see with washed coffees. It's also worth noting that natural processed coffees require a lot of attention from the pickers, since you are not density separating your coffee as much. With natural processed coffees, a lot of attention is paid to the drying process itself. They require a lot of labor to make sure that they're constantly rotated so that the cherries dry nice and evenly. So they tend to be a little bit more costly and a little bit higher risk for producers to produce those types of coffees. Moving down from there, you'll see varietal. Now varietal is telling you specifically what type of plant the coffee plant is that was being used to assemble the lot. Sometimes you'll see a single plant varietal, and other times you'll see a blend of a few different types of plant varietals. Within the world of coffee, there are basically 4 main groups of varietals. We have heirloom varietals, which are predominantly coming from Ethiopia, and that's where we're going to see the most genetic variation and some very interesting, unique, pronounced flavors. We also have coffees that are from the Bourbon lineage, coffees that are from the Typica lineage, and then we have kind of a group of hybrid Catamor coffees that are a mix between Arabica and Robusta. And these coffees are really designed to create a plant that is a little bit more disease resistant, is a little bit more resistant to high heat, and is generally a little bit easier to grow. Typically speaking, these kind of Catamor coffees can produce less favorable flavor results, but some really skilled, smart farmers are finding ways to make these coffees taste amazing and delicious. But within all of these kind of 4 main groups, you're going to see different types of varietals, and you're going to see different flavors with each varietal. Some varietals like Bourbon and Caturra are quite similar in terms of flavor, and then sometimes you'll see a varietal like a Pacamara or an SL28 or an SL34 that have much more pronounced flavor characteristics. So notice what you're brewing on your bag and see if you can start forming some associations between different varietals, and just notice some of the unique tastes that each of these varietals can offer. And then on the very bottom of the bag, you'll notice that we have this little white square, and this is where we put the date that the coffee was roasted. When we are roasting coffee, a huge part of what we're doing is we're breaking apart sugars inside the coffee. And as we break apart those sugars, one of the byproducts is CO2 gas. And that gas builds up inside the freshly roasted bean and needs to dissipate a little bit before we can brew with the coffee. Now, having gas coming out of the bean also means that we are limiting the amount of oxygen that's getting access to the coffee, so it can help prevent coffees from prematurely staling or oxidizing, but it can make it a little bit tricky to brew with the coffee. So typically you want to let a coffee rest for at least a few days after roasting. 1 day is kind of your bare minimum, and different people have very strong opinions about how far out from a roast date they prefer to drink their coffee. So feel free to experiment and see what you prefer. So that is all of the terminology that we are using on our coffee bags here. Next up, we're going to go over to our roaster and talk about some of the roasting specific terminology that we use. All right, so now that we've talked about specialty coffee terms that are relevant to the bags and the terms that we use on our packaging, let's talk a little bit about terminology that is specific to the roasting process. So first, let's talk about our roaster and what the general roasting process looks like. So this is a Proster 15 kilo. This is the THCR12 model that we're using. And you can see this is a fairly standard drum roaster. So we've got our hopper at the top, which is where we load our green coffee. We have a drum that rotates. This drum is lined with screw-like veins on the interior. They're gonna help the green coffee to fold over itself during the roasting process. This drum is situated over a flame, a heat source, which is how we manipulate heat during the roasting process. And then we've got our cooling bin down here, which is when we finish a roast, we want it to cool as quickly as possible. Our machine is hooked up to our computer behind me, and our computer is how we do all of our roasting. We log all of the data from our roasts and we reference them against past roasts to make sure that we're being super consistent with all of our roasting here. So when we are going to roast a coffee, the first thing that we do is we set our drum at the correct initial starting temperature, what we call a charge temp. And what we want to do is make sure that when we drop the relatively cold coffee into the hot drum, that green cold coffee is going to equalize with the drum temperature at the right point and give us enough energy to roast the coffee the way that we want to roast the coffee. We then load our green coffee up into this hopper here and then open it up and drop the coffee into our drum. Once it starts, then we're referencing our curve on our data logging software, and we're manipulating the heat and we're manipulating airflow to get it to match our time temperature curve just the way that we want it. We are very precise and very specific with all of our coffees. So every coffee is going to have its own unique ideal time temperature curve, and it takes a while to figure out what that curve is. So everything we're tasting, we're sampling, we're cupping these coffees and finding that kind of peak point of flavor with each coffee. Once we finish our roast, once we reach that ending time, that ending temperature, and we've finished the roast the way that we want to finish it, we open up this door here and we drop all of that hot coffee into this cooling bin. Now this bin has a fan underneath it and it's pulling ambient air through that hot coffee, and we are trying to cool that coffee as quickly as possible so that it stays right at that ending temperature that we selected. And by cooling it really quickly, we end up with coffee that's nice and clean and sweet. So now that we've kind of outlined the basic roasting process, let's talk about some of the terms you might hear surrounding roasts. The biggest term you're going to hear is the degree of roast, which is typically expressed as something being a light roast, a medium roast, a dark roast. What this is referring to is the ending temperature of the coffee. So how high the temperature got and how much the coffee was essentially cooked during the roasting process. This can give you a little bit of information about the coffee. Typically light roast coffees are going to be a little bit more fruity, floral, vibrant. Medium roast coffees are going to be a little bit more chocolatey, caramely. Dark roast coffees are going to be a little bit more of that kind of smoky, woody type flavor. But these terms don't give you quite as much information as you might think. They don't tell you what the time temperature curve looked like. They don't tell you how quickly or how slowly a coffee was roasted. So it doesn't necessarily give you the full picture. So when you're selecting a coffee, try not to get too hung up on these terms of light roast, medium roast, dark roast. And instead, we really encourage people to look for the types of flavors that they like to see in coffees. So if you are drawn to more of those fruity, floral, bright flavor characteristics, look for coffees that have more of those in the description. And if you're drawn to coffees that are more in that caramely, chocolatey range, look for coffees that have that in the description. Smoky, woody, look for those in the description. Another term you might hear when it comes to coffee roasting is first crack and second crack. These both refer to audible popping sounds that we hear during the roasting process. Think about when you're popping popcorn, it's that type of sound. First crack is when we are breaking down sugars in the coffee. As we're heating up coffee, these sugars are caramelizing, they're reacting with proteins, we're browning these sugars, we're rearranging them, we're creating new flavor compounds. And one of the compounds that we produce, one of the byproducts we produce is water. And as that water is building up inside that coffee bean, at a certain point, it starts to force its way outside and it expands the coffee and we hear this audible popping sound. That's what we refer to as first crack, and this is primarily caused by sucrose breaking down inside the coffee. first crack is meaningful because once that coffee expands, it really significantly changes the density of the coffee. It starts to turn into something that we can actually grind and brew and create a beverage out of. And then also once you have less water inside the coffee, it greatly accelerates those browning reactions that take place. So you really start to develop the coffee in a more significant way, which is how we get to the final kind of end temperature and the final desired development stage of the coffee. Second crack is when CO2 builds up to the point that it forces its way out of the bean. Typically, second crack is a more violent sounding cracking sound, and that is kind of the dividing line that separates what we'd call medium roast coffees to dark roast coffees. After you pass second crack, the bean itself starts to degrade a little bit more. So that's when you start to see the oil from the interior of the bean moving to the exterior of the bean. So if you've ever wondered why dark roast coffees can sometimes look oily or wet, that's why that happens. Another term you might see is some roasts are specifically identified as being good for espresso. And this can be a little bit confusing. One big thing to keep in mind is that espresso is just a brewing method. It's just a means of preparing coffee. And it's kind of a special way because we are using pressurized water. We're creating a much more concentrated beverage than you would typically see with standard brew coffee. But that's all it is. It's just a means of preparing coffee in a more concentrated way. So really, you could use any coffee in espresso, and you could make any coffee very successfully with an espresso machine. That being said, some coffees are going to be a little bit more what we'd call forgiving in espresso than other coffees. So the hardest thing to do when preparing espresso is to make sure that we're getting the full extraction out of the coffee in a way that's staying very even throughout the whole coffee bed. Remember, any unevenness is what tends to cause unpleasant flavors in coffee. So if you have a shot that's a little bit unevenly brewed or maybe a little bit under extracted with some brighter, fruitier, more floral coffees, it can sometimes taste rather unpleasant when you don't brew it absolutely perfectly. So for roasts that are specifically identified for espresso, we try and develop them in a way that if you under extract the coffee a little bit, if you don't do an absolutely perfect job brewing it, it still tastes pretty good. But again, any coffee can be used for espresso, and roasts that are labeled as espresso roasts are just ones that us roasters feel might perform particularly well, but it's not gospel by any means. You could put anything you want in there, so please feel free to experiment around and try not to get too caught up on some of that terminology. Another big thing you'll see when it comes to looking at coffees and identifying different types of coffees is this distinction between a blend and a single origin coffee. So a single origin coffee is a coffee that comes from a single location. And what we typically try and do is give you as much information as possible about exactly where that coffee came from. So oftentimes these are coffees that are coming from a single farm, a single producer, maybe even one specific lot within a larger farm, or maybe these are coffees that are coming from coffees in a cooperative within one small region in a producing country. But typically these are coffees that are coming from a small, specific, very traceable area. Versus blends are when you're combining multiple components together, and oftentimes you're going to be combining components that are coming from completely different growing countries or maybe even different continents across the world. Typically speaking, blends are designed to be a little bit more balanced in flavor, versus single origin coffees tend to be a little bit more complex and a little bit more expressive as far as the flavors that you'll notice in them. Another thing you'll frequently see with blends is that a lot of blends are made to perform particularly well with different brewing methods. So you might see blends that are made to perform especially well when prepared as an espresso, or blends that are made to perform especially well when prepared as a brewed coffee or a cold brewed coffee. Really, you can use any coffee for any purpose, so feel free to experiment. But when we're balancing flavors, we try and find ways to balance them in a way that's very beneficial for these specific methods. One term that can be very confusing for people who are, especially people who are newer to specialty coffee, is the term acidity. So when us roasters are tasting coffees and talking about it, acidity is literally what we're tasting when we're talking about the fruit acid flavors within a coffee. So acidity should be very pleasant, fruity, clean, sweet type flavors inside a coffee. Oftentimes when someone refers to acidity in coffee or says that a coffee is too acidic, what they're really saying is that this coffee tastes harsh to me and it has something that feels unpleasant about it. It's important to keep in mind that we're talking about perceived acidity of the beverage, and that perceived acidity does not have a strong correlation with the measured pH of the beverage. So really, pretty much all of our coffees, when we brew them here with our local water, we end up with around a 4.8 pH. And that doesn't change much, even if we have one coffee that tastes a little bit brighter and one coffee that tastes a little bit less bright. Oftentimes, when someone says that a coffee tastes acidic to them, what they are trying to communicate is that the coffee has an unpleasant, harsh flavor to it. This is 9 times out of 10 a result of a coffee either being under-extracted or unevenly extracted. So if you feel like that's what's happening in your coffee, maybe look at trying to increase your extraction level and see if you can get a little bit more sweetness to balance out the coffee.